And this is what we're going to cover. We'll talk about the writing section of the examination for the Certificate of Proficiency in English, ECPE. We'll talk about the writing scale, how the writing section is scored. We'll share some samples and we'll have some tips to prepare, to help students prepare for the exam. So how does a writing section work, Luke?
So the PE writing section consists of a prompt that's meant to elicit C2 level writing from students. So we're hoping to see evidence in students' responses of the following can-do statements, which come from the CEFR. So we're hoping to see evidence that students can produce clear, smoothly flowing, complex reports, articles, or essays which present a case. There's a couple of tasks to choose from, and they prompt students to write an article or a proposal or an essay that's going to showcase their opinion and multiple viewpoints as well about a certain topic. So there should also be evidence that the students can write engaging descriptions of experience, of their personal experience, and that will be presented in a style that's appropriate to the genre. So if they're writing a proposal, it should be in a register that would make sense when writing in that specific genre. We hope to see an appropriate and effective logical structure within the student's response. So it should flow smoothly from point to point with information that's organized together clearly in paragraphs, for example. And as I mentioned before, there should be multiple perspectives on the topic, which will be complex of an academic or a professional nature. So there should be multiple opinions about that topic, including the student's own, which should also be clear to the reader when they're rating the response. And then finally, there should be a very broad lexical repertoire of idiomatic expressions and colloquialisms. So we want a wide range of vocabulary and grammar being used accurately and consistently throughout the response.
Great. So this is really important because it's basically describing what students are expected to produce in general. So this will answer many of the questions that some of you sent. Mm-hmm. These are some of them. How many types of writing are there? And especially questions about the proposals. You can see some of those here. Is there a specific layout? What is the ideal structure for a proposal? The proposal and the structure, presentations, a clear presentation of the proposal writing. Any comments about any of these?
Of course, yeah. So as I mentioned, there are a few different types of writing that can appear. Task 1 will always prompt students to write either an article or a proposal. And then task 2 of the prompt gives students the choice to write an essay. So regarding the proposals, there isn't really a specific layout that we require. There's multiple ways to write a proposal, but what matters most is that there is an argument or a clear opinion that's being presented and developed clearly throughout that, and that it's organized in a logical way. So we're going to see some examples of how that can be done. So Fernando has brought up the prompt and what it actually looks like here. These are examples from the May 2022 administration of ECPE. There's always 3 sources, visual sources, that are at the top of the prompt that students will be expected to incorporate and integrate into their response. So they must incorporate at least one. If they do not, the score of their response will be reduced. So they always want to include one of these sources. They will be asked to evaluate multiple viewpoints and to also include their own opinion, which they're trying to support with details and factual information. And you can see task 1 in this specific prompt is asking for a proposal. It may ask for an article in some cases, and task 2 is asking for an essay. And regardless of the task you choose, there are 45 minutes given to the student to actually create their response. So here's another example. As you can see again, 3 different visual sources at the top. This one is about well, there's many sources about gasoline and electric cars, and all of these relate to the 2 tasks below in a couple different ways. So whenever you see these prompts on the PE writing section, you're always going to see that they're constructed in the same way. So the first part of the prompt is a claim, and that is the part that is squared off in red. So in the second task, some governments are encouraging more people to drive environmentally friendly electric cars by providing a refund of 10% of the purchase price. So the claim is a factual statement about something that is happening in the world and the student is going to have to respond to this claim in some way. And they'll respond to that claim by answering the question, which comes in the next sentence. So what positive and negative effects might this have? So this is what the student will be writing about in the response. And in the third sentence, you always see the actual task instruction. So for the second task here, that would be to write an essay addressing this topic and to give your opinion about it. If you look in the very first task, task number 1, the actual task instruction is to write an opinion article for the community website addressing the various viewpoints on this issue and your opinion about it. So once again, both tasks are asking for an opinion, but the framing is a little bit different, and then that might result in a slightly different response. Then the final sentence of the prompt, this is always the same. It's to include at least one piece of information given above to support your response. And once again, students definitely need to include at least one of those sources above to actually fulfill the task requirements here.
And this description also applies to the proposal, right?
That's correct. The proposal also begins with a claim as well. In this case, that would be the local city council wants to close several downtown streets to personal automobile traffic in order to make the downtown area more pedestrian friendly.
Sorry, that was the article that was mentioned in the other one. This one is the example of the proposal here.
My apologies. Yes, that's right. It's always the same for the proposal or the article. The claim is the very first thing. So in this case, a local school plans to require all students to spend 1 year studying abroad. Many people are concerned about this idea. And then the student is going to interact with that claim by writing a proposal to the school principal, evaluating the different sides and explain what you think should be done. So that is the task instruction in this case. And then they need to include at least one piece of information from the visual sources, just like for the article and the essay.
So some more questions from the audience then. Why do the two writing tasks have the same topic? Why not two different topics?
That's an excellent question. The two topics are actually, they're similar, but they're not exactly the same. And the reason that they are similar is because the sources that go with both of the tasks, they have to be able to relate to both of those tasks, and they have to have information that the test taker can use to respond to both of the questions and the tasks. So if it's an article and an essay, they can't be too different because then the sources won't really relate to what the student wants to talk about. So there is some flexibility in that the topics are slightly different, but they have to kind of be on the same page to a certain extent so those sources can be used.
Does the writing task always involve discussing, exploring multiple viewpoints? And the other question is kind of somehow related to that as well. Is it always about the advantages, disadvantages, or are other essay types likely to be used as well?
Another excellent question. Regardless of the task, multiple viewpoints are going to be brought into the response by the student. Sometimes the tasks specifically ask for the advantages and the disadvantages of a certain point. Sometimes it's just asking for multiple viewpoints and for the students to evaluate those viewpoints. So regardless of the language used, the pros and cons of multiple sides of an argument are going to be explored, but sometimes it is specifically asking for advantages and disadvantages, or maybe just to explore multiple viewpoints.
Several people asked about the timing, and of course that's a concern that all students have all the time. Is 45 minutes enough to finish the essay?
Completely valid concern, but in this case, 45 minutes is definitely an adequate amount of time. It's actually more time than the original version of the PE prompt used to have. So when it was revised a couple of years ago, that time was increased. We piloted the test with many students to make sure that it was adequate, and we found that it was definitely enough time for students to create a sufficient response to the prompts.
And especially at the C2 level of proficiency that they're expected to demonstrate the command of a language within this reasonable amount of time for that particular task. That's why the piloting was very important.
Exactly.
Okay. And many questions about the new section with all the sources. We have 3 sources of information that were introduced now in the last revision of the test. We have several questions to go over. Some of are related in some way, are similar. So do you want to go over some of these?
Sure.
Verify some information?
Yes, definitely. So the very first question, this is a very important one. What is the acceptable incorporation of the visual prompt in the essay? So it's very important that students integrate these prompts into their responses and use them to actually build upon an argument that they're trying to make. So the context in which the prompts are used is very important. So we're going to see some examples of how the prompts can be used successfully and unsuccessfully, but you don't want to simply just copy the prompt and drop it into the response and then not have it actually connect to anything else that the student is saying. So hopefully they will build on the point being made in the source to then back up any claims that they themselves are making as the writer of the piece. So how they actually incorporate it, there's a lot of flexibility there. Quoting and paraphrasing, one is not necessarily better than the other, but if you are simply quoting the source, it is very important to then expand on what the source is saying so the student can actually use their own words to kind of talk about what the importance of that piece of information is and what the consequences of that would be in relation to their argument. So it's definitely okay to use a very short quote. It's definitely okay to paraphrase it, but what matters most is the context of how it's used. So where you include the source in your response, you can be successful if you include it in an introduction, in a conclusion, at some point in the middle. It just matters that you are purposefully using that source to actually make a larger point that ties into the main argument that the student is trying to make.
Great, and this also goes back to the C2 description that you're the level of proficiency and integrating sources and providing information from different sources. That's part of the origin of this additional piece for the writing prompt.
Yep, exactly.
Great. Let's get into the rating scale. Several people were asking about the scoring rubrics. The rubrics are on our website on the details page for the ECPE. Are there any special areas within the rubric? What is the most important element that an essay should have? Somebody was asking. Is there anything in particular that they have to elaborate on?
Well, one thing that always comes to my mind when thinking about PE responses is the inclusion of a specific argument and opinion that is then fully developed throughout the response. And that's not really one thing. There are many different criteria that go into that to make a student successful in developing an argument. So we're going to take a look at the rubric actually and see all of the different elements that go into creating a successful element. But that's kind of a successful development of an argument. That's kind of the main thing we're looking for, but there are many different building blocks that go into that. So we'll see what those building blocks are when we look at the rating scale next.
And the rubrics are the same for the essay, for the proposal, for the articles. Do they differ in any way?
The rating scales are the same, regardless of the tasks chosen. The prompt will still elicit that C2 level writing and the different elements that go into that we mentioned earlier. So they are rated in the same way, regardless of the task that is chosen.
Great.
So yeah, here is the rating scale then. So these are the 4 different categories that we're looking at and rating when rating these responses. First one is task completion. So we're looking to see that the response is actually on topic, that it clearly relates to the specifics of the prompt that the student is responding to. There should be multiple viewpoints represented in there, including the test taker's own opinion. And then the sources that are included in the prompt should also be integrated in a way that successfully expands upon the argument the student is making. So that clearly relates back to the CEFR descriptors of being able to evaluate multiple perspectives and to distinguish the student's own opinion from the other ones in the sources. We're looking at the development then of the argument that the student is trying to make. The depth of support and the organization is very important here. Are there many supporting details? Are the ideas expanded upon with maybe the student's own personal experiences? Or do they simply list reasons one by one and then move on without much development beyond that? So we hope to see that complex information that's organized in a logical way that's easy to follow. For language, we're looking at the grammatical control and the vocabulary range and usage of the students. So we're not specifically looking for specific structures or specific vocabulary. What's more important is that there's a wide range of simple and complex vocabulary and grammatical structures as well, and that they're all used accurately, consistently throughout the passage. And then finally, the authorial voice is very important because students are integrating sources and integrating multiple viewpoints into their response. We want to make sure that their own unique voice is not lost. So their original opinion, their original thoughts should also be present in the response as well. And that in turn creates reader engagement. It engages the reader and makes them interested in what the writer is trying to say. So if the student is able to do that well, they will get a higher score. And we'll look at examples of how all of these things can be done successfully and not so successfully to make it a little more clear what we mean by all of these things.
Perfect. Few more questions then about the rubrics, and we talked about those first. Which is better, a short writing with a strong argument or a long writing with a more diluted argument? Well, that's a good question.
That's an excellent question. You definitely want to strike a happy medium. The length of a specific response is not so important when compared to the content that's actually in the response. So, I taught English for 10 years, and whenever I gave an assignment like this, a writing assignment, of course, the first things my students wanted to know was, how long does it have to be? What's the minimum amount I have to write to be successful? And I know students don't always want to hear this, but unfortunately, what matters more is really the information that's present in the response, not the length of it. So it's possible to have a shorter piece of writing that very efficiently and effectively lays out an argument and expands it with multiple examples and supporting details. It's also possible to write a very long argument, a very long piece, a very long argument that's just very redundant and repeats the same information again and again. So in that case, having a longer argument is not necessarily going to benefit you as a writer. So you want to make sure that you're developing your argument fully with unique information that all ties together. You're not writing less than you need to, but you're also not writing more than you need to by just repeating that same information over and over again. So trying to focus on the content is what is most important in that regard.
Great, and you covered majority of these questions about the length in relation to that one as well. Was one about sources. Are test takers who do not include any of the sources in the writing text disqualified?
Another good question. You're not fully disqualified by not including any sources, but your score will definitely be reduced if you do not include at least one of those sources. So students always want to make sure to include at least one source in a way that will, effectively build up the argument that they're trying to make.
Because that was part of a design of the specifications of the task itself. It's included in the task for the 3 types of writing.
Exactly. Yep.
So here we have 2 of those areas.
Yep. Here we have task completion and development. So these are some of the descriptors that kind of set apart a score that a response that might receive a 5 versus a response that might receive a 1. So for task completion, we're looking to see that the prompt specific topic is addressed, all the task requirements are met. So maybe both sides of the argument are evaluated, a source is included, at least one. As you go further down that list, you'll see that the response becomes more generalized, like the 3 has a more general response. Maybe some of the task requirements are ignored, a source is still included. But if you go down even further, you'll see that the response is very general, not very specific to the prompt, and that potentially no source at all is included, which is definitely going to result in a reduced score. It's a very similar thought process for development. A higher scored response is going to have an extensively supported and detailed argument, many examples, lots of experiences from the test taker included in the response. It'll be very well thought out and convincing in a organized in a logical way that's easy to follow. But if that organization suffers and multiple points are kind of included in multiple different paragraphs that don't really go together, that's going to then bring down the development score. And then if the ideas do not have as many supporting details, then that's going to bring down the development as well.
It's important for teachers to know these different areas because, as you were explaining, our raters will be evaluating task completion, development, language, and authorial voice separately. They will assign a different score for that, and then the compiled scores will be reflected in their final score that students receive. But each of these areas will be evaluated separately, right?
That's correct. Yep, that we have these specific categories so we can really narrow and drill down on the specific skills that the students are able to demonstrate evidence of being able to do. Mm-hmm.
The next section of the rubrics is related to language, and these are all the questions, some of the questions that we received.
Yes, so we kind of addressed some of these points earlier. What do we expect to see in terms of vocabulary and grammar use? Are there specific things we'd like to see in terms of grammatical rules and structures? And we do not have a specific list. We don't want to limit the test taker. C2 level writers, they should be able to use language as a tool to get their point across. And sometimes it's better to use simpler language to do that. Sometimes it's better to use more complex language. So we expect these students, if they're at the C2 level, to be able to use a combination of simple and more complex structures to be able to express themselves. So we're not looking for specific things, but we're looking for a wide variety of structures and vocabulary. And then we're looking to see if the student can consistently use that wide range of things accurately throughout their entire response. Another question here is about whether informal writing should include short forms, abbreviations, and acronyms. And I think it's just important to point out, we always want students to keep in mind the register that they think they should be writing in. So if they're responding to the proposal or the article, that's going to be a very formal type of writing where you probably are not going to use short forms, abbreviations, and acronyms. You really want to consider the audience of who would be reading that response. Very similar for the essay. You want to be thinking about, if you're writing a general academic essay to an academic educational audience, what would they expect to see? And they probably would not be expecting these types of informal language that are mentioned here. And then that's basically what this language rating scale is demonstrating. At the higher levels, there's a wide range, there's a flexibility and a high degree of control of simple and complex syntactic structures. And then there's precise, sophisticated vocabulary that is appropriate to the context. So the register is appropriate for the genre they're writing in. And as you go down this list, you'll see that the control of those simple and complex structures becomes less and less. When you go down to the 3, you'll see that maybe no complex structures are present at all. There's only simple structures that are the student can demonstrate control over. And then even lower than that, maybe the student cannot demonstrate control of the simple structures at all. So the less precise the vocabulary is, the less control of the grammar that the students demonstrate, the more their score will be reduced. All right.
More details about the authorial voice?
Sure. So yeah, this is an excellent question. I'm sure many people are wondering about how to do this well. So we're going to be looking at examples, which will make it more clear how to include the authorial voice in a piece of writing. But the main thing we're looking for here is that the content, even though the student is incorporating multiple sources, referring back to multiple viewpoints and other opinions, that the content is still going to be original through the use of maybe paraphrasing and building off the sources that are quoted to expand using the writer's own voice. And through that, they'll be able to engage the reader. So if the content is not as original, if they're just repeating language from the prompt and the sources, that might bring down the authorial voice rating a little bit. So we'll see examples of how this can be done well and not so well. And then some things that students always ask about, that many people ask about, that are actually not present in our rating scale are spelling mistakes and handwriting. These are not accounted for in the rating scale. Spelling mistakes are not going to reduce the student score. Illegible handwriting will not reduce the student's score. But that being said, the handwriting has to be clear enough that we can read it, so we can actually give a score in the first place. So in a case where no score is given, that would be because no response is given. The response is completely illegible. We can't read it at all. The response is written on a different topic than the one assigned, or the response is written in the test taker's L1 or a language other than English. So I've never heard of a case where the handwriting has prevented us from rating a response, but be sure to always just write as clearly as you can to avoid that from happening.
Great, thank you. I saw that there were a couple of hands that were raised. Well, we incorporated many of the questions already, so we're trying to get to finish on time. And if we have time a little at the end, we'll take a couple of questions. But if not, I'll give you my email and I can send you can send me questions and we will respond to the questions after the webinar. We're trying to finish on time. We have a few samples of performance since you were asking about that in particular. That was one of the specific things that everybody wanted to hear about. So here is the first sample. It's a proposal. There were several questions about proposals, and it says, a local school plans to require all students to spend 1 year studying abroad. Many people are concerned about this idea. Write a proposal to the school principal evaluating the different sites and explain what you think should be done. Include at least one piece of information given above to support your response. I didn't include the sources here. That's why I'm referring to sources being above. And this is what, let's say that I wrote this. You will tell me, look how I did. Introduction. Our school is considering requiring all students to spend 1 year studying abroad. While there are people who welcome the idea, others are strongly opposed to it. This proposal examines the advantages and disadvantages of such a plan and presents various practical recommendations. Benefits. The students do no doubt stand to benefit in a variety of ways from this plan. Firstly, they expand their horizons, they visit a foreign country, they learn about its history, its culture, and its people. They communicate with them and they make new friendships, which will probably last for a very long time. Moreover, they are able to use the facilities from the schools they will be studying at, which are likely different from those we have here. They will learn how to adjust to different unfamiliar environments and how to coexist with people with different cultures. Also, they will have the chance to use a foreign language they learn at school, as they will have to understand what the people around them are saying, but also be understood by them. Drawbacks. There are, however, valid concerns. Firstly, not everybody can afford studying abroad for a year. According to a recent news report, the cost of staying at a European hotel almost doubled from the year of 2018 to the year of 2019. This means that it is harder nowadays for the families to allow their kids to study in a foreign country, as the expenses are higher. Furthermore, the students may face difficulties in their education since they will be native speakers there, and the vocabulary they will not be native speakers there, and the vocabulary used in classes will probably be unfamiliar. Recommendations. Taking everything into consideration, I personally believe that the chance to study abroad is a promising idea. However, my opinion is that it shouldn't be a requirement. Students should be able to choose themselves whether they will study abroad or not after consulting their parents and knowing what they think about it. So what do you think, Luke?
All right,
will I pass or not?
I think it has the potential, definitely. This is a very well-written essay, and I think we will see how it provides a lot of evidence that the student can write at a C2 level test. At a C2 level writing. So let's see how they were able to do that. Looking at the task completion specifically, this prompt is definitely on topic, and it's very specific to what the prompt was asking for. It specifically addresses students who are studying abroad and why that might be a positive or a negative thing for them. It fulfills the requirement of writing a proposal from the very first paragraph. They explicitly state that they will be evaluating both sides of the argument and then giving a recommendation based on that information. And that is exactly what the prompt asked them to do. So that's very well done and ties in exactly to what we were hoping they would be able to do. They do incorporate one source. So that's what's squared off here. There is a source. It is a chart that shows the prices of hotels in Europe have gone up from 2017 to 2019. There's an upwards arrow. And they refer to that here by saying that according to a news report, the cost of staying in a European hotel has doubled from 2018 to 2019. And they don't simply include that piece of information. They actually explain the consequences of that and how it relates to the argument they're trying to make. So here they're talking about the drawbacks of studying abroad. And they explicitly state that the rising prices makes it harder for certain students to actually afford to study abroad, which creates a very difficult situation for them. So they do a good job of integrating the source and giving it some context to explain, to further develop the argument they're trying to make. So that ties into their development here. They are clearly developing their ideas as they do with the source example. In the paragraph about the benefits, they list many, many supporting details to describe the benefits of studying abroad. So people make new friends, they get to live and work and learn in a new environment. They get to actually use a language in real life outside of the classroom. So they don't list one thing and move on. They have many different examples to explain why studying abroad is a positive thing. And then in the way that they organize the information, they actually use headers. They have the benefits in one paragraph, the drawbacks here, and then the recommendations at the end. You don't necessarily need to use headers to organize your information. You can have paragraphs that are clearly about one specific thing, but this approach works very well for this test taker. The drawbacks paragraph only includes drawbacks and nothing else, so that works very well. And then finally, in the conclusion, the writer's main idea is convincingly explained. Now, they acknowledge that this is a complex topic. There are many positives and many drawbacks that may make studying abroad a good or a bad thing, depending on the person. And they could effectively communicate that by saying that they acknowledge that it's a good thing, but that it should not be required because it may not be a perfect fit for everybody. So they develop their argument very well. And then the language, you can see, you probably heard when Fernando was reading it, he did not stumble very much. It was very easy for him to read. Even though there's many complex structures here, a lot of sophisticated vocabulary, it's all used correctly with almost no mistakes. And the writer very effectively moves back and forth between simple language, simple vocabulary, simple grammar structures, and more complex ones. So they're able to effectively communicate their points through that. And then the authorial voice. The student is relatively successful, somewhat original content. If we went back and looked at the very first paragraph, we would see that some of the language is taken directly from the prompt. So the prompt specifically says that a school is requiring students to study abroad, and the test taker kind of took that exact same sentence and put it into the prompt instead of paraphrasing it. But other elements of the prompt, they did paraphrase and make their own. So they do have their own language here. They use the source and then expand on that in their own words in that second squared off box. So their own voice is present here. And then there are additionally expressions to emphasize the writer's argument and engage the reader. So I think in the paragraph about benefits, the writer specifically says, studying abroad will no doubt benefit test takers. So there's a little bit of emphasis, and the writer's own voice and their own personality comes through in their writing here.
Great, very clear explanation. Let's see what everybody thinks based on how careful they were paying attention. How would all of you rate this as a high pass, pass, fail, or low fail? We're not using the entire rubric in this case, but it's basically to give you a little bit of practice in some way. So let's count to 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have more than 60% of the people responding already. And we got 64% say it's pass, 34% say it's high pass.
Very interesting.
Okay, we have very demanding teachers. Others are more accepting. And what was the result?
High pass.
This is a high pass, yes.
Definitely. So even though this may appear to be on the shorter side and only one of the sources is integrated, the argument the student is making is done very effectively and efficiently. They very clearly lay out the many different reasons someone might want to study abroad and how it benefits them. And then even though the drawback section it's not as developed, there's not as many reasons, they do an excellent job of pulling in that external source and explaining the consequences of it. So there's really no need for them to pull in additional sources to make their point. They've established that studying abroad can be good for some people, maybe not for other people. And that's their main point, is that it can be a good thing, but it's not really something that should be required because it's not practical for everyone. So, and they communicate that very well with the language and the sources that they chose to use.
And you have arguments from all areas of the rubric, from all those 4 categories supporting that.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's look at another one. Local school plans to require students to spend 1 year studying abroad. Same topic for the proposal. So this is the sample. Introduction. The aim of this proposal is to examine the local school's recent idea to require all students to spend 1 year studying abroad, evaluate the different sites, and make recommendations about it. Positive reactions. On the one hand, the idea is a welcome one. First of all, students will be able to learn things from another education system, providing that countries have different ways of teaching. Furthermore, they can learn about what cultures and traditions. As a tourism expert says, most travelers do a little research before visiting a new place to get a little preview of what they're going to face. Negative reactions. On the other hand, many people are concerned about this idea. Firstly, the prices of the hotels have been increased, which makes it even more difficult to stay abroad, as a lot of families can't afford the cost. More specifically, according to a recent news report, in the last 2 years, the cost of staying at a European hotel has dramatically been increased. Moreover, people usually combine travel to a foreign country with vacation, which may lead to laziness and not paying attention to the class. Conclusion, both proponents and opponents make valid points. Essentially, I think that studying abroad will be a great experience. However, the schools should examine the plan carefully before they decide. Plus, the governments could decrease the prices of hotels so students can afford it.
All right. So this response, I think we can see some of the differences as compared to the first response. So let's look at the individual categories to see how they differ. First of all, task completion, they do address the topic as well. They're talking about whether studying abroad is a good or a bad thing, and they address both sides of that issue. They have the positive reactions and the negative reactions in separate paragraphs. Again, their opinion is given in the conclusion, so their personal opinion is present among all these other opinions that they're sharing from the sources. And in this case, all three sources are used and integrated into the response, but they're not as well integrated as the previous one. For example, we have here that the prices of hotels have been increased, which makes it difficult to study abroad. And then the next sentence, it kind of just repeats that same piece of information again. It says that European hotels, the costs have gone up again. So they're not really expanding on the point. They're just kind of repeating themselves there. But then they do include another point from another source that people usually combine travel in a foreign country with vacation, which may lead to laziness. That's an excellent point to make. It's a creative use of the source, which said that the majority of people view and align travel with vacationing as opposed to education. But it would have been nice if they expanded on this point a little bit more. Why will it make it difficult for them to succeed in class? Give some examples, maybe talk about their personal experiences to expand on that point. So speaking of expansion of the development here, it is adequate. There are many sources that are brought in, and they briefly touch upon like the consequences of the information in those sources. They don't fully develop them, like with the laziness in class issue. They don't give specific examples of what that would actually mean in practice. So what that means then is that they rely a little bit too much on the sources. This first paragraph on this page here, 90% of it is just information from the sources, not so much the speaker's own voice. So they're not really elaborating on these ideas. They're just kind of introducing them and then moving on very quickly. But they do organize the information clearly. As I mentioned before, positives are in one paragraph, negatives are in one paragraph, and the headers help to make it clear what they're talking about to the reader. The language, pretty good command of simple and complex syntactic structures. There's a few more grammatical missteps in this one as compared to the very first reading, but there is some complex vocabulary. We have proponents and opponents in the final paragraph, but it's not as consistently used, that complex vocabulary, throughout the actual response. And finally, the authorial voice. The content is simply just not very original. A lot of the language is taken from the prompt sources. The prompt itself is basically repeated verbatim in that introduction paragraph. And then instead of expanding on the sources with their own words and their own language, they're just basically repeating the information from there and then moving on very quickly. So there's not much for the reader to engage with when they're reading this response.
Let's see what everybody thinks.
Mhm.
How would you rate this other sample? This is going much faster now.
I think we've kind of we have aligned ourselves with the audience, I think, a little bit more here.
Yeah. Okay, we have 70% already. So this is what we see. Do you see the results?
We have 59% staying pass, and I would agree with that. So this is definitely a passing, not a high pass, but a passing result. More sources are included. They're just not included as effectively as they could be. A lot of the language is not the writer's own. So if they had included more of their voice, that could have pushed them a little bit higher to maybe a higher pass area, as opposed to what they ended up with.
Let's look at another one. This is an article. The government wants to encourage reading by sending each student one book every month until the age of 18. Some citizens are excited about this idea, but others think tax money could be spent on other initiatives. Write an opinion article for a local website evaluating the different sides of this idea and your opinion about it. Include at least one piece of information given above to support your response. And you have those three sources there. And it says, it is a well-known fact that nowadays the government wants to encourage reading by sending each student one book every month until the age of 18. Some citizens are excited by this idea. On the other hand, others think that money could be spent on other initiatives. It is vital that we consider what are the positive and negative effects of this. First of all, this option has many advantages for students and community. A recent study, 89% high school students who use popular social media sites every day. Also, one of the most important benefits of reading is that reducing, because by reading books, you can relax from all problems every day. One of the most widely debated issues is that reading builds vocabulary. For example, you learn a lot of things and you be given professor on vocabulary. However, another interesting of reading is that you can understand different words and meanings. In addition, though reading you can understand complex ideas, it means that you can communicate and socialize with other people. Another one positive effect of reading is that you developing critical thinking skills. It means that you can be a very good student. On the other hand, this option has many negative effects. Today, teenagers, they do not like very much to reading books because their leisure time spending to surfing on the net, who play video games. Last but not least, 1975, 60% high school students reading a book, magazine, or newspaper daily. Then in 2016, 16% students reading a book, magazine, or newspaper daily. Taking everything into consideration, I definitely think that it is high time we did something about this problem. In my opinion, I definitely agree with the first option because reading is part of and parcel of my life.
All right. So let's take a look at what this student did well and not so well. Not quite as successful as the previous two examples that we've looked at, I think, but they still did some things successfully. So in regards of task completion, they do discuss the topic, whether books should be sent out or not to people to read, to students to read, and they do give their opinion in their conclusion of what they think should be done. Unfortunately, even though they include all of the sources, they don't really integrate them to actually build upon the argument they're making. For example, one of the sources lists the benefits of reading, and instead of expanding on the importance of those benefits, they simply just list them as well. They say that it can increase your vocabulary in the paragraph on the previous slide, and they just repeat the same thing over and over. Essentially, there are 3 sentences that are all saying reading expands your vocabulary in different ways without explaining like what benefit that would give to students. They do expand a little bit in the first paragraph on this slide. They say that being able to understand complex ideas can help you communicate, and that reading can help you develop your critical thinking skills, but they don't really give examples of how that will benefit. How does developing your critical thinking skills make you a good student? They introduce the topic, but they don't explain why or give details to support it. So they don't successfully integrate these sources as well as they could have. Along those same lines, the ideas are just not really fully developed. In the paragraph here about the negative effects, they say that teenagers don't like reading books, they like to spend time on the net. And then they mention that there are more people reading books in 1975 versus today, but they don't, explain the importance of that. So there are less people reading today. They could have explicitly tied that into the government's idea of sending books to students to increase the amount that they read, but they don't make that connection clear. So they're basically just taking ideas from the prompts and the sources without really explaining the importance of them and tying them into their argument. The language, a little bit more difficult for Fernando to read than the other samples. So there's frequent errors with grammar, some vocabulary is misused, especially when they try to use more sophisticated language. So, and if you were to go back and look at the first paragraph, you would see that it's basically taken verbatim from the prompt. They're just repeating language from their prompt without including their own voice. So the authorial voice suffers in this response. Lots of content taken from the sources without the language being changed or added to. No unique examples to support the writer's claims, as I mentioned before. Critical thinking skills can help you in school, but how? If they had given us some examples, maybe from their own life, that would really have benefited the student in this case. So there's not a lot for the reader to engage with here. They're just simply reading information, facts, with no opinions to really tie into those things.
Great. I already launched the poll for this one. Seems to be going faster this time.
Definitely. I think everyone's on the same page at this point.
Yeah. So we have more than more 70%. So we have the great majority, 75%, saying that this is failing.
Yep. And in this case, that is what our raters decided on as well. This is a fail. Many sources are included. The test taker is responding to the prompt, but they're not really building a coherent argument. They're just including factual information and not tying it all together into their point, which is that it is important for students to read. So they could have been more successful if they did the things we had talked about.
Okay, and this last sample is about different prompt. Some governments are encouraging, the essay says, some governments are encouraging more people to drive environmentally friendly electric cars by providing a refund of 10% of the purchase price. What positive and negative effects might this have? Write an essay addressing this topic and give your opinion about it. Include at least one piece of information given above to support your response. To begin with, one of the most widely environmental issues are cars that use gasoline. The government provided a refund of 10% of the price for the environmentally friendly electric cars. Lastly, future cars have many positive and negative effects. One of the negative of the electric cars is their prices. I would like to say that in the average gasoline are cheaper than environmentally friendly cars. Based on a recent article, the price of gas car is $600 less than an electric in average. Also, some other people are a bit worried that they will not come into town that is the most traffic with gasoline cars unless it is convenient, based on Jason Jones, that is a local business owner. Some other people say that the transportation type that average people uses pollute the environment. Based on UK study in 2019, gas cars have 190 kilometer emissions, electric cars have 71 kilometer emissions, and bus has 105 kilometer emission. To conclude, it was a hotly debated topic, and I feel that gasoline cars are making many issues on the environment and pollutes it, so electric cars are friendly to the cities, and the people are going to come back in the downtowns.
All right, thank you, Fernando. Let's take a look at what this student did well and not so well. In regards to task completion, they are on topic, but they do not really fulfill all the task requirements. They are only focused on the negatives of electric cars. They don't talk at all about the benefits of they talk about the negatives of gasoline cars. They do not talk at all about the benefits of electric cars. They mention that they can be beneficial in the very end of their response, but that is it. The sources are mentioned, but they're not integrated at all. They simply list that the information, again, that is in those sources, electric cars are more expensive, but maybe more beneficial to the environment, but they don't explain the consequences. What does that mean in relation to the argument they're trying to make? So their ideas are not supported. They're simply listing and including that information from the sources without expanding on them. And they don't really organize their passage in a way that is logical. They jump from the price of cars to what this business owner thinks about people coming downtown. And the connection between those 2 points is very unclear, and the reader cannot really establish that connection by themselves. In terms of language, even simple structures and simple vocabulary, the use of those things are confusing here. There is very confusing use of sophisticated vocabulary, so it's very hard for the reader to actually figure out what the test taker is trying to say in many of these cases. So since there's a lot of content from the prompt and the sources and no expansion on that to further expand the reader's argument and their opinion, the writer's argument and their opinion, there's not much original content for the reader to latch onto and to engage in this case. So this is basically a lot of sources all jumbled together with no coherent argument being made based on information in those sources.
And the poll is already out. Everybody is moving really fast.
Definitely. Everyone's doing a great job.
It's not a full calibration session, but it's working really well.
Yeah, definitely. Everyone must be paying really close attention.
So the great majority think this is a low fail. What do you think?
Yep, and that is correct. Our raters came to the same consensus. They are on topic here, but they do not really communicate what they're trying to say effectively. They're just throwing in sources and hoping that it all kind of connects, but they're not doing the work to make that connect for the reader themselves.
Mm-hmm. So thank you. That was very useful information. I'm sure everybody liked to see those different samples and how they are rated. Some final ideas about teaching tips, resources. There were several questions about preparation resources and how teachers can help students be better prepared for the writing section in particular. Do you have any special tips, Luke, that you would like to share?
I think the main tip that I would share with teachers is to give students the opportunity and the chance to look at arguments and to evaluate multiple sides of those arguments, all the possible sides, and give them the chance to write about why one side may be correct, why the other side may be correct, but also the downsides of those arguments as well. So giving students the opportunity to explore all sides of an argument and to communicate that in writing would be very helpful in preparing for the PE writing section.
Great. And where can you find some materials to help students? There are several things on our website. We have a writing research pack for ECPE that includes lesson plans, activities, prompts, commentaries. There are sample tests on our website as well. This webinar, it will be recorded and we're recording it and it will be published on our YouTube channel so you can see some of those prompts and some of the samples. As usual, we're based on research and best practices. We highly recommend a kind of more interactive and process-oriented writing approach to teaching writing and going through different stages, analyzing different samples of writing, working on reading and reading and reading to help them improve their writing. And there were questions about how to be better prepared to analyze some of those different topics, and having original content to create ideas, help them, engage them in more reading activities, and help them to discuss and explore, debate, practice in different ways. But in relation to the writing itself, some amount of time dedicated to the pre-writing stage, even during the day of the exam. It's important for them to spend a couple of minutes organizing their ideas and not just write from the beginning so that they know more or less what they can do for those different sections that Luke was describing, actually writing and then having some time to revise and edit what they did. You're well aware of the different activities and things that you can use for more interactive classes to work on writing. And this is at all levels in general. It's not just only about ECPE, but there are several activities that you can do in an interactive class for pre-writing or more collaborative writing and working together on some drafts and benefiting from that interaction and how other people think about that and face that topic in some way, and how to correct, revise, work on that process as well. There were several questions about preparation. We answered many of these throughout the webinar already. A few questions were about the age of students, that they might be very young and they might not be prepared for that. That's why I was suggesting getting them to read, to discuss topics, to bring new initiatives to class and work on those together as a whole class. But based on what everything that Luke was describing, and the information about the prompt, information about the rubrics, and all those different areas that are used in order to evaluate the ECPE writing section, these are some possible suggestions and ideas. Some questions were about areas that we had identified where students are failing or where they're not doing well in general. These are some of those areas, and some possible ideas to work on them to improve them. One of the key things is really addressing the prompt and responding what is actually provided within the prompt, not necessarily writing exactly what the prompt says and using the same language, but mainly responding to the topic and completing the task. Luke mentioned one of the examples that was talking about the general topic, but not really responding to that particular task and not completing that. That will be critical. So reading all the requirements, understanding everything that they have to do, probably analyzing other kinds of writing samples where the prompt is addressed or not, and recognizing when they are reading other people's samples, how they can decide whether this author actually accomplished that or not. That can help them become more critical and improve their own writing as well. Fulfilling the requirements of a selected writing task, it's similar to what we're just describing. Analyzing samples can help them become more critical of their own, but also planning their response will be important for that purpose. Using at least one of the sources, as Luke was explaining, and not just using the source verbatim, but integrating that into their elaboration, explaining how that fits in within the whole argument, not just kind of mechanically including something as part of one of the paragraphs without relating to supporting what they're actually saying with that. And reading more academic articles, finding other sources and elaborating on that, practicing how they can support that and integrating that in a kind of a well cohesive and integrated way will help them become more experienced with that kind of writing, and including the sources. Working on original ideas, providing something of their own, not just information that is provided in the prompt or the task or the sources. So working together, brainstorming ideas, giving them different topics and coming up with a variety of areas and which they can organize into advantages or disadvantages or pros and cons or the different topics. Getting them to brainstorm that, and that idea generation will help them to be better prepared in class. Obviously, good essay needs to be well supported with sufficient amount of information, sufficient details that provide a well elaborated response based on different arguments that are well supported. So analyzing articles and also brainstorming, choosing topics in class and working individually or in pairs. Making lists of supporting details, how they can elaborate on a certain topic will help them. Organizing ideas logically, coherently. Luke talked about that already when he was referring to the prompt. Accurately using a wide range of structures. As Luke explained, it's not a certain set of grammatical structures that is expected. What ECPE essays or tasks need to include is a wide range of syntactical and semantic grammar and vocabulary, showing command of not only simple structures and vocabulary, but also more sophisticated, more complex structures. So reading will help them. Getting more practice with advanced grammar will help them. Practicing, like having several simple sentences and combining them into more complex structures will help them. The same about vocabulary, working on their own vocabulary and having several vocabulary development activities will help a lot. Engaging the reader, Luke mentioned several references to that as well, but including language and comments that make the reader think that you're writing for them and you're engaging them as part of that elaboration of your own argument, or kind of requiring or expecting some kind of response from that reader. Making sure that whoever is reading this will feel that you're considered in part of that response in some way, and he was writing to you. There were more specific questions. Here's my email address, or you can send information to info@michiganassessment.org or marketing@michiganassessment.org. But if you have more specific questions about your course or anything that we couldn't cover today, feel free to write to me, and I'll do my best to respond to you. So thank you very much. Thank you, Luke. Great pleasure to work with you on this session. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for this webinar. We'll be sharing the recording later, but we hope to hear from all of you soon as well. So if you have any comments or questions, feel free to write to us. Anything else from you, Luke?
I just want to say thank you to you as well, Fernando, for presenting with me today, and thank you to everyone for joining us. I hope that this was a helpful session and that the additional materials that Fernando pointed you to will be helpful in your preparation for the test as well. So good luck in preparing your students, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Great job with your students, getting them ready for the December exams or the next May rounds. But we hope to keep hearing from you. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye, everybody.